Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ORF. And I think this special talk by Ambassador Simons, Paul Simons, on a topic which I think energizes us all, those who look at international relations, strategic studies, or aspect of global economy. I think this is a topic that continues to fascinate as researchers, as scholars, but also as practitioners. The complexities of energy security are an issue which I think practitioners are grappling day to day. I think only Mr. Trump and energy are good. In a sense, they are the two most important issues on the table at the moment, it seems. But we are very grateful for Ambassador Paul Simons for coming here and giving us his time to talk about this issue, and which I think he has titled it Energy Security in a Dynamic Political Environment and a Transitioning Energy World. All the keywords are here in terms of what we should be discussing today, and what I think he will present in his presentation. I would just briefly introduce him before I let him have the floor. He's, of course, the Deputy Executive Director of International Energy Agency in Paris. And so therefore, coming from him, and I think coming from an agency like like IEA, we are looking at some of the most important strategic trends that perhaps we are witnessing or likely to witness in the coming years. And I think it would be wonderful to hear from him firsthand what is their assessment and how do they see the energy environment panning out over the next decade or so. And so he'll speak for a few minutes, and then I'll give the floor to our in-house energy expert, Lydia Pal, who will be raising some of the issues from an Indian perspective. So with that, Ambassador, the floor is all yours. I think he'll be making a PowerPoint presentation. So,
thank you very much, Dr. Pant, and thank you for this invitation to be with you at the ORF. We're really delighted. We're honored to be here with you this afternoon to share our views on global energy. I'd also like to thank Dr. Powell for accompanying us, and I wanted to recognize the IEA team that's with us today, Bruce Murphy, who's our IEA program manager for India, and Mr. Siddharth Singh, who is our local country coordinator here, who's doing a great job. For those of you who don't know the agency, the IEA was set up in 1974. It was born out of a geopolitical crisis, the first Arab oil embargo, and it was set up largely initially as a group of consuming countries, oil-consuming countries, industrialized consuming countries, to basically create a situation in which strategic oil stocks could be managed in such a way as to avoid economic shocks that might occur in future oil crises. And we've been around for more than 40 years, but the mandate of the organization has shifted quite a bit over the intermeeting period. We've taken on new responsibilities. And our executive director, Dr. Fatih Birol, very well known here in India, has visited India, I think at least 5 or 6 times since he took over in 2015, has very close relations with all of your ministers. But he has initiated a modernization program for our agency, which is built around 3 strategic pillars. One of those is redefining energy security to not only include oil, but also gas and electricity security, because in many of our member countries, in fact, electricity has become, to some extent, the #1 issue, and managing electricity and making sure the lights don't go out is what keeps most of our ministers awake at night. The second issue is turning the IEA into a truly global agency, global energy agency. And in that regard, India has joined China, Indonesia, and other countries as one of our 7 associate countries in the broader IEA family. So we now have very regular engagement with India, a very robust work plan, and we're very involved in coordinating with India on many issues related to oil, related to renewable energy, the new ISA we've been supporting, electricity system support, work on renewable energy, work on energy efficiency, work on energy statistics. So a lot of the same issues that we work on with our member states, we're working on now with India, which is a truly important country, and I'll say more about that in future. And then the third area of modernization for the IEA is really turning this organization into a global hub for clean energy technology and energy efficiency. We continue to work very heavily on fossil fuels. We certainly feel fossil fuels are essential in the future, but also we're turning more of our attention to energy technology. So those are a few words on the agency. I will now go directly to the presentation, and I'm going to say basically divide the presentation into 2 parts. First, a little bit on energy security and oil security, what we're up to these days, what the philosophy is, how it's changing. Over the years, the IEA has defined energy security as uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. The agency is not interested in price fluctuations. Our members are not interested in that. And therefore, we work with our member states both on sort of longer-term security issues, making sure that investments are in place to ensure that we don't get these types of bumps, both in oil as well as electricity. And also on the more shorter-term challenges, which could relate to supply emergency situations, interruptions in supply. As I mentioned before, our mandate has gone beyond oil, also to look at gas security issues. We issue now an annual gas security report highlighting vulnerabilities and actions that countries around the world are taking to mitigate some of those risks. And most recently, electricity security issues. And most of the electricity security work focuses on the role that renewables are playing more, especially variable renewables, and how can variable renewables, solar and wind resources, be introduced into electricity systems around the world in ways that contribute to energy security. How can that variability be offset and introduced in a way in which the overall system continues to function well? And so we've actually been working here with India. We'll be introducing a report tomorrow that takes a look at power system flexibility. How can the fossil resources that back up the renewable resources be deployed in a more flexible way to ensure that the overall system is in balance? This is a very large part now of the IEA work as well. Oil security challenges. There are many different types of challenges around the world, different categories, technical type disruptions, outages when things go out when they shouldn't, pipelines, and other types of outages. Lately, we've had natural disasters as well that can provide major interruptions in oil as well as electricity supplies. There are social issues also. Some social issues are longer term, others are shorter term, but they need to be dealt with as well. And of course, we have critical oil choke points around the world where large flows need to pass and in which there could be political type interruptions. So we take a look at all of these challenges. There's never a dull moment. It's hard frequently to predict which supply interruption may combine with another supply interruption. For example, 1 year ago, I don't think anyone around this table would have expected that we would have lost a very large chunk of Libyan supply, which we did over the past 6 months. or that Venezuela's oil supply would go down as sharply as it has over the past year, or that those two issues necessarily would be combined. So there are obviously many challenges to take a look at in terms of monitoring the oil supply security. And this is something that we do every day at the IEA, and we're in dialogue with India on this issue as well. The emergency stockholding system is something that has been created as a way to some extent, signal to global markets that there are provisions in place in the event that some of these supply challenges come up on us in ways that are unexpected. So under the terms of the International Energy Program of the IEA, all of the countries of the IEA pledged to do two things. Number one, those that are oil importers need to maintain 90 days of imports in terms of their stocks. But all IEA countries, and increasingly we have more oil exporters as well in our community, all oil countries, all members of the IEA are obliged to have in place systems in which they can respond to emergencies with collective action. So they have to be able to deploy oil resources on demand when an emergency is called. Those resources can either come from their strategic stocks, or they can come from surge protection, or they can come from demand restraint. So this is the system that's been put in place over the past 40 years. We've only actually used it, we've only deployed it 3 times. It has been deployed, but it's not so much the deployment of the system that makes it effective, it's the fact that the system is in place and the marketplace knows that it's in place. It provides a certain amount of calming and security to the market at all times, because the marketplace knows that these reserves are available. And of course, India is developing similar kinds of reserves as it becomes a larger importer. So this is an important point. The 3 times that we did deploy, they were different types of crises. They were quite different, actually. The first was Gulf War situation, Kuwait in 1991. Actually, I happened to be working on that crisis at the time at the State Department, but not on the oil part, on another part of the planning. And but certainly, I recall that all of the countries that were involved were very concerned about the impact on oil prices of that crisis. And so the IEA mobilized resources in that case. The second case was very, very different. I also had the opportunity to personally participate on it when I was the U.S. representative on the IEA governing board. It was the hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico in 2005, Hurricane Katrina and Rita, which actually knocked out a tremendous amount of the refining capability of the United States, because a lot of the U.S. refineries are right there in Texas on the coast, and they got hit very badly. So the U.S. was actually in very keen need of refined product, and the IEA called forward an emergency, and that allowed a lot of refined product to flow from Europe to the United States to alleviate that shortage. And then the third case was 2011 during a Libya crisis, when the IEA also responded to a geopolitical crisis. But you can see in the blue there was lots of other geopolitical crises that were even larger in terms of their impact on the global oil market, but in which, for whatever reason, the IEA countries decided not to deploy the oil. Now, there were various reasons. There might have been enough other oil sloshing around. There could have been, and in many cases, the OPEC countries raised their hand, said, we can meet this emergency, no need to release supplies. This is frequently the case from the OPEC side. We will hear that type of message. Or other producers say the marketplace can handle this on its own, no need to release supplies. And in many cases, that has turned out to be the case. But nevertheless, the reserves are available to be used when they are needed. Now I'm going to say a few words more generally about some global broader energy trends. This is from more recent IEA analysis from our World Energy Outlook, which is our flagship publication that takes a look at trends that go out to 2040, kind of longer term trends in the global marketplace. And four of the big messages that we had in the most recent report. First, really, India moving to center stage in global energy. I'll have more to say about that later, but if you take a look at any of the fuels or any of the major technologies, oil, gas, coal, renewables, power, energy efficiency, energy access, India is very much the center of the picture globally now. Secondly, the role of the U.S. In terms of oil and gas. It's definitely becoming much, much more prominent as a result of the shale revolution. We're expecting U.S. oil output growth actually to capture about 80% of the growth in global oil demand from now to 2025. So the U.S. shale revolution has a lot more way to grow. U.S. gas production as well, expanding, and the U.S. is expected to be one of the largest suppliers of LNG as well to global markets in the very near future. Third issue, declines in the costs of clean energy technologies have become rather dramatic, and in particular in the case of solar PV, photovoltaic. And we actually have predictions in our report that by 2025, solar PV will be the cheapest source of new generation in India. Will be more competitive than coal in 2025, and be more competitive than coal in China by 2030. Costs of wind power also coming down substantially. Battery costs are coming down. So the clean energy technologies are definitely becoming much more competitive in the future. This is a major message we have from the IEA. And then the final message has to do with electrification. And here, what we basically see is a world in which overall global energy demand increasing only by about 1% a year, but electricity demand worldwide increasing by 2% a year, and by much higher than that in countries in the emerging world. So a lot of growth of the middle class accounting for this, more digitalization, more air conditioning in particular, especially in countries like India. So more of the electric vehicles contributing to this to some place as well. So those are the major trends. I'll say a few words on the particular fuels now. And oil trade, I think, important to note this slide. It's a little complicated, but the major messages are the Americas increasingly self-sufficient and becoming oil exporters. This is the U.S. and Canada and Mexico. This is a difference looking ahead. At the same time, developing Asia really quite an appetite for oil imports, even if we see movement on vehicle electrification, and I'll talk about that a little later. So China's import needs growing substantially, India's as well as the fleets grow, especially the truck fleet. So Asia, developing Asia, relying on the Middle East, but also relying more on the Americas to draw in crude from all over the world. Europe, quite frankly, Europe and all of the current OECD countries' energy use are very stagnant. These countries have largely decoupled their economic growth from their energy growth. So looking forward, virtually all the energy growth in the world coming from the emerging countries. No more energy growth from the developed countries because of this decoupling. Changes, some structural changes in the economy, but really a big focus on energy efficiency that is enabling energy use to go down. I mentioned before about India really becoming more important on the global stage. And this is illustrated in both of these charts. The left chart is primary energy demand. You can see that India, the dark block below, taking the driver's seat, accounting for about 30% of global energy demand growth between now and 2040. It's really quite massive. Even more in terms of the change in global oil demand. Now, we don't see global oil increasing by that much over the next 30, 40 years. We got a vehicle electrification coming in. We've got power generation moving away from oil and industry as well. But we do see that India's share in global oil demand changes will be very, very substantial. Another area of concern, energy access. Back in 2010, we still had a substantial number of people without access in the world, about 1.3 billion. That's been cut somewhat by 2016. India, quite successful. India is the red bar up the top, down to about 200 million people. And then by 2030, we really see India completely eliminating all remaining energy access challenges. Already there's been tremendous progress with all the villages connected this year, but even the remaining again, the remaining individuals in the rural areas that don't have access will be fully satisfied. This is a major achievement. Remaining access challenges will remain in almost all in sub-Saharan Africa. We think also the rest of Asia, the rest of developing Asia will have resolved its energy access issues by 2030. But it's the rural areas in Africa that will have the biggest challenges. And here we think, there are a lot of off-grid, mini-grid solutions, but they take time to put into place. So again, tremendous success on the part of India. A few words on oil. I mentioned before the U.S. really leading the charge in terms of global oil supplies. I mean, here you can see the differential with a rather commanding share of global oil capacity, supply growth in the next 5 years coming from the United States, lesser amounts from Brazil and Canada, but most of it really focused there in the Americas. This also reflects something that we came out with yesterday. We issued our investment report, our annual investment report, and we pointed out that the fracking industry in the U.S. is now on a financially sustainable footing for the first time. It's generating positive cash flow, and also the break-even costs of the U.S. frackers come down virtually in half over the last several years. So the industry is quite vibrant at this time and poised for further growth. Turning to natural gas, situation really changing quite a bit in terms of trade, and the relationship between piped gas and LNG we think is going to change substantially. So here you can see on the left only about 40% LNG this past year, but looking out to 2040, all the growth virtually in gas trade will be LNG. We don't see a lot of piped gas. So there'll be a big growth in overall gas consumption. We're expecting about 1.6% a year. Gas will grow much quicker than oil or coal. Coal will be fairly flatlined. Oil will grow very little. We still see natural gas as a fuel with a lot of potential in the future, but the trade increasingly focused on LNG, which basically means for a country like India, more choices in terms of suppliers. In terms of who will be those exporters, again, some big changes. Russia and Caspian continue to be large, but Australia taking a more important role. Bruce, your country moving ahead, as well as the U.S. and Canada, and the Middle East, that's largely Qatar. So the three most important countries in terms of global LNG export being Australia, the U.S., and Qatar. Bruce has asked me to introduce them in that order. I was going to say the U.S., Australia, and Qatar, but I'll say Australia, the U.S., and Qatar. So again, that's on the export side. On the import side, Europe share declining. Europe will be importing a bit more gas because its domestic reserves will go down, its domestic production. But Asia really taking the commanding lead here. Asian importers, China, very important, as well as India, and the traditional importers, Korea and Japan. But Korea and Japan not really increasing too much. The increase is more China and India. And, oh, there they are. They appear. I didn't know they appeared. Okay, so you can see them there. Unfortunately, India is buried under other Asia, but India is the main part of the other Asia there. So you can see Japan and Korea shares go down. So we're also expecting a shift towards a more flexible liquid global market in terms of LNG. Exactly how quickly that happens, we're not sure, but it seems to be moving in that direction. At the same time, we see some major declines. Again, I mentioned this before, in the costs of wind and solar PV. Offshore wind and onshore wind, you can see offshore wind's coming down quickly. Onshore wind's been a steady decline. But in particular, solar PV, it's been a remarkable success story. Already reduced by a factor of 2 between 2014 and 2017. We're expecting another factor of 2 between now and 2020. And so this is a substantial achievement. And a lot of this has been achieved through the auction procedures that are in place in many, many countries around the world. Looking at where electricity growth is going to come from, this is annual additions. You can see over the last 6 years, renewables have really taken a commanding position in terms of capacity. Now, this is not output, this is capacity, not generation. But solar PV and wind taking commanding lead, but coal still quite significant, as well as natural gas. But looking out to 2040 in terms of annual additions, we see coal going down substantially. A number of coal projects that are being planned now, being executed. We still see coal use going up, countries like India and Southeast Asia, but we see China flattening its coal, and many countries in Europe having net retirements, as well as the US, net retirements. Gas has continued to be important in terms of gas-fired power to complement renewables, but really renewables, the big story, up to 160 gigawatts a year. That's consistent every year from now until 2040, 160 gigawatts. So we're quite optimistic. And again, where will this come? China, India, and the US, very, very important in terms of solar PV. Europe, bigger in terms of wind. Now, electric vehicles, turning to electric vehicles, they're off to, we're moving ahead. We only have 3 million electric vehicles. We expect electric vehicles to go up on our base scenario to almost 300 million in 2040. Led by China, but this will still only be a relatively modest share of total vehicles on the road, but it will be a substantial increase. At the same time, we don't think the impact of the EVs on global oil will be that tremendously big. We see passenger cars, maybe 1 million barrels a day going down between now and 2040. But we see lots of other parts of the oil sector being more difficult to phase out of oil. Trucking, aviation, petrochemicals, be more difficult to shift these to other fuels. So on a net basis, we still see in our baseline scenario, this is not our climate-friendly scenario, but they're kind of on the basis of existing policies, we see oil demand going up a small amount, about 1% a year between now and 2040. Now, on our more ambitious climate-friendly scenario, we would see the number of electric vehicles tripling to almost 1 billion by 2040. We'd also see oil use coming down more substantially, but still we'd have 70 million barrels a day of oil used in 2040, even in a 2-degree scenario. So we don't think the oil is going away quite so soon. Clean energy technologies, we are tracking these as well in terms of we're tracking them against a 2-degree scenario, and quite frankly, we're a bit behind in terms of the investments. We have 4 out of 38 technologies that are so-called on track to meet these environmental goals. Solar PV, been very successful. Electric vehicles, lighting, LED, led by India, and data centers. But we have another group of technologies, a group of another 23 that require a lot of improvement, a lot of the energy efficiency, technologies are not moving quickly enough. Nuclear power, hydro, and others, hydrogen, and then we have another group of technologies, 11, off track completely, that really need additional support if we're going to meet our environmental goals, in particular carbon capture and storage, which is essential for the decarbonization of a number of industrial sectors, as well as to complement with the coal in power generation. So still a lot more work needs to be done in terms of energy technologies. India has also been a leader in energy technologies and has worked with us closely in many of our technology programs. So that's a quick overview of global energy. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you again for the invitation. And I think Dr. Powell say a few words.
Giving us a broad and very interesting overview of the trend lines that we are witnessing on the energy dynamic. And I think Lydia would like to complement that by sharing some of the anxieties, aspirations, challenges that India faces, and then we can open this up for discussion.
I'll start with some general remarks. You said that the future is electrifying because of dematerialization, decentralization, and digitization. I was just wanting to ask you if there is a contradiction, especially in the context of decentralization, because societies have been rewarded for size, villages to cities and so on. And this has been based on high energy, high intensity energy sources, which involved a lot of complexity and hierarchy. Will renewable energy support the same type of society? Will decentralization mean that we have to completely reorganize the other side of energy, that is the use of energy? Has sufficient thought been given to that side of energy? There's a lot of thought on replacing high intensity, high emission energy with low intensity, low emission energies on the supply side. Has adequate attention been given to the demand side? Will societies and their activities have to be reorganized temporally and spatially? That's one question. The second question is on the energy security aspect. We've always seen energy security as a reduction in dependence on imports, dependence on technologies and fuels. What would energy security look like when we move to a low carbon environment? Will it be the same thing? Will it be reduction of dependence? Will we have a kind of renewable energy mercantilism? That is, we promote exports of technology and try to reduce imports. Will it mean export of technology only or export of energy also? That is one question. And the second thing is, what will be the shift in geopolitical power? For example, in the fossil fuel era, geopolitical power meant that we had to control resources. In the electrified world, probably geopolitical power will arise from the control of grids, which means that it will be shift from stock to flow, and shift from hard power to soft power, which means geopolitical power will involve management of the grid, knowledge, technology, managing intermittency and so on, relationships, ideas and so on. So in this context, I think, for example, Norway has said that it is going to be a capacity companion to the European Union because it has hydropower. So is there a similar chance in South Asia? Now coming to India, I just have I don't have any disagreements with what you've said. I do think that fossil fuels will dominate. That's what all other predictions also say. BP's recent prediction also says that fossil fuel share will just marginally reduce from 95% to 82%. That's because BP does not take into account the non-commercial energy, whereas IEA does. So one thing is, in India, societies are used to unreliable power, and they have less dense ties to the grid. So which means they have very high capacity to cope with the intermittency and so on. They can easily shift between electricity and non-electricity options. And they also have the tradition of adjusting time of their activities. Would this give India an advantage when we shift to renewable energy sources? And my last point is the role of the state. If for the last 20 years I've looked at the energy sector, the critique has been the role of the state in the energy sector. Almost all the analysis has been to reduce the role of the state. Will renewable energy change that? Will the role of the state become important? Because this change, energy transition, is being driven by the state. So the entrenched role of the state in the energy sector in India and probably in other countries, including China, will that become an asset rather than a liability? Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. And I think you've raised a lot of questions for the ambassador, and I'll let him answer that. But before that, I will also, I think, share with him a report that we did on the geopolitics, which he raised of the latest crisis, that is the JCPOA and its impact on India. This is particularly about India and how this impacts Indian interests in various ways. But I think maybe you would like to respond to some of the questions that have been posed before I open this up for the audience.
Thank you very much. That was quite an excellent and difficult set of questions. I will do my best to answer them. I hope I don't spend the rest of the time available answering them, but they're very good questions. The first question had to do with renewables and sort of what type of society we'll have with decentralization and digitalization. Will we have to kind of, are we going to move toward a low intensity society? And on the demand side, will we have to kind of reorganize ourselves? Because the traditional model was a great big utility just spitting out this energy. And I think it's a little too early to know because we are looking at the impact of digitalization, but we don't know how quickly we'll move to a digitalized future. The IEA analysis, most of the IEA analysis on renewables suggests that sort of looking ahead, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, about 60% of the renewables are expected to be utility scale and about 40% decentralized over a longer period of time. So certainly utility scale, and up to now, most of the renewables deployed worldwide have been utility scale. But of course, decentralized are increasing, and we're starting to get a lot of lessons learned from decentralized renewables. Places like California, Western Australia, Southern Australia, rooftop type installations, things like this. Even in Thailand, we're learning things from decentralized renewables. On the demand side, yes, there will probably definitely have to be changes. And demand side management is something we're taking a close look at. How is it, and it's basically how do you cope with the variability of these renewables, and how do you fit them into the system? What's the best way to fit them into the system in a way that when the renewables are generating at peak, perhaps generating more electricity than is needed at those peak times, and essentially you can sell those renewables into the system at zero marginal cost. How do you keep value in those renewables when, at the peak a day? So those are challenges, and demand management is critical to that. It's linked to smart grids and other things, but one thing we're looking at, and a number of countries are looking at this, and states within the United States, is how can you combine storage as well as flexible management to create incentives, use different pricing systems, time of day pricing, time of hour pricing, in such a way that you capture as much value as you can from those variable renewables. I think this is a huge challenge for the future. We're looking at this, our renewables people, our systems integration people are looking at this issue. And related to that is the question of how do you stack up your fossil fuel that is supporting some of your larger electric grid capacity so that it's more flexible so that it can come in and provide energy security if, let's say, you have a sudden interruption, sudden unexpected interruption in your renewables, not predicted. Do you have the backup? Can you move quickly enough and more flexibly enough so that you don't have interruptions? So we're definitely looking at all of those issues in the IEA. I think they're critical issues for the future. A lot of it also has to do with sort of the financial side, how utilities can be incentivized to encourage this demand side management. And that's another important issue that we're looking at. We're going to look at it in this year's World Energy Outlook, in which electricity is the key fuel. So I think this is an important question. We don't have all the answers, but we're starting to look at it. The second question is energy security. In a low-carbon environment, what would the definition of energy security be? If there are reductions in dependence from renewable energy, how is that going to kind of change the picture? Are we going to have renewable energy mercantilism? Is there going to be exports of energy technology? Or different countries going to be, I guess, the winners? Who's going to be the winners or the losers from this clean energy future? That's a big question. I cannot answer that question either. But I think one thing is that the definition of energy security is something that everyone is taking a close look at. And I think one of the conclusions that we've come to is that renewables can improve energy security in many countries around the world, and energy efficiency can improve energy security in a big way. So yes, there could be a different constellation of countries that manage their renewable resources effectively and that manage energy efficiency effectively can be winners. Now, whether that means they export this and get mercantilistic about it, I'm not so sure. But certainly in a low-carbon environment, if countries or states or municipalities can find ways in which they can successfully manage that variability in the renewables, that's really the key. And that's what we're looking at too. As the renewables move up the scale, as you get from 10%, anybody can handle 10%, no problem. Then you get to 20, 30, 40% renewables, then it becomes considerably more challenging. So we actually put out a publication this year for the Clean Energy Ministerial where we identified the kind of level of renewable penetration and the different challenges that are associated with that level. And it gets harder as you move up the ladder. It gets trickier, and you have to be more aggressive. And yes, I think there was a question about government. Yes, the government has to step in. And government at different levels. But certainly this kind of clean energy future can definitely work hand in hand with energy security. Third question was the shift in geopolitical power. Is a more electrified world, is control of grids more important? Is that going to become kind of the geopolitical strength? And what about knowledge and technology and relationships? Are we shifting from hard power to soft power? Well, I think the issue that a lot of our member countries are focusing now on in terms of the electrified future is the challenges associated with cyber security. So it isn't so much, it could be a bit defensive. In other words, countries need to make sure that in a more electrified future and a future in which the interconnections go from country to country, that they are appropriately protected against cyber security risks. And so this is an issue that is becoming much more important in the future. And certainly as the world becomes more electrified, I would say that this concern about cybersecurity will become much more important. I don't know as far as other aspects of geopolitical power. I think there are countries that will be, I mean, certainly we are encouraging more cross-border electricity links from one country to another. They've worked very, very effectively around the world in places where they've been deployed. And in a more renewables intensive future, most of the scenario work that we've done suggests that perhaps one of the most vital tools in terms of offsetting variability is expanding the size of the grid, especially in Europe, so where the interconnections even now are not that great. So there's a huge kind of energy sector benefit from having a larger grid, from having not just a country like Denmark have access to the Norwegian hydro, but to have other countries have access, or to have other countries in Europe have access to, for example, solar power from countries like Morocco or Spain. There are definitely energy security benefits to that. And as the percentage of renewables gets higher, the variability within the renewables themselves can offset. The one renewable can offset another renewable. In other words, if the wind could be operating, at different peaks from the solar, or the solar in Spain will, let's say, especially with respect to time zones, because a lot of the peak power requirements have to do with what time zone you're in. Frequently, it's 6 to 7 p.m. And if the sun isn't shining in your location, but if the sun is shining maybe 1 or 2 time zones away, and that power is very cheap, that could be very attractive to shift kind of east to west, not north to south, east to west. So we're looking at we've done a lot of work on this. In fact, we saw, for example, that Spain, if you had interconnection between Spain and Sweden, you could have extraordinary synergies because Spain has a lot of solar power that would be available to meet the peak needs of a country like Sweden. So there's I think there's a lot of work to be done here. There are risks, of course, there are political risks. There's a lot of political risk reasoning why some of these interconnections have not been undertaken in the past. So those political risks would have to be managed. But I don't know that they're any different. Well, they're a bit different from other political risks, but we have political risk associated with gas pipelines and with oil connections. And so with electricity, it's natural there'll be some political risk there. But it's certainly, we think that that's part of the future. The question about India, society used to unreliable power and intermittent power. Would it be kind of advantageous to India to adopt renewables because, people would kind of culturally be more accustomed to dealing with the intermittency? Maybe I'll ask Bruce if he could answer that question, because he's the India expert. My inclination would be to say India is going to have more middle class, and therefore, as you rise up the income level, I think your tolerance for intermittency may well go down. That would be my gut instinct to say maybe what's true today will not be true as the middle class inevitably expands here. They will demand power. They won't be so willing to put up with intermittency. But I don't know. That's someone who is not an expert on the local culture. So Bruce, could you please try this one?
Absolutely. Did you just see what he did there? He waited for the hardest question, and then he holds me over. Well done. I'm learning, Ambassador. But the first thing I'd point out is when I first lived in India, in the very first days, before I moved to Paris, I was based in New Delhi, and one of the first people I met was Lydia. And I think I always came out of it a more knowledgeable, more intelligent, probably a better person all round. So thank you. And it's exactly these sort of questions where I think, I haven't quite had the question asked that way, that's really made me think. So I don't have a perfect answer, but I do think there's parallels with a lot of other technologies, like the development path for India might not follow the traditional way. So things like, you know, the adoption of mobile technology versus landlines and all the way that moves. So there might well be some technology leapfrogs that you might well see open up different opportunities for the intermittency of renewables. So a roundabout, I don't know answer, but a very interesting question.
Intermittency by using inverters and generators. I think even the affluent among us will know that.
Bruce, then the last question was the role of the state. The entrenched role of the state. What will the role of the state be in the future, given that the states have been very important in terms of promoting renewables up to this point? As we have a green energy future, will the state continue to be important, or will the private sector be able to drive all of this on their own? So the IEA analysis suggests two things. Number one, costs are coming down very substantially. So the need for some of the types of government support programs for renewables that existed in the past are declining. So that's, I think, one important point. And as I mentioned before, in our World Energy Outlook analysis, we suggest that with no subsidies at all, that by 2025, you know, solar PV will be the most competitive technology in India. So we certainly see the need for state kind of economic props, subsidies should continue to go down. But then the question is, can you still move, will that alone be sufficient to kind of drive the world in the direction of a very climate-friendly future? And I think in the view of the IEA, the answer is that there will still need to be a fair amount of state support, especially on energy efficiency issues, even though energy efficiency ought to be able to pay for itself and can pay for itself. We found in the past that programs like the LED program here in India, or we're going to introduce later today our air conditioning report, introducing minimum energy performance standards, tighter ones for air conditioning, is very difficult to do just with the market itself. It needs a bit of push from governments. So probably the government role will continue to be important, especially on energy efficiency, probably a little less so on renewables. But certainly the energy security aspects as the renewables are increased, keeping an eye on those energy security issues will be important, and keeping an eye on making sure, and this is an issue we're covering in our World Energy Outlook this year, ensure that the utilities, the electric utilities, because a lot of this renewables will still be in the central system, some will be distributed, but a lot will be central, that there's enough resources available to the electric utilities so that they can make a profit and they continue to make the investments that are necessary. I mean, we don't want to have a situation in which you know, there are subsidies, a lot of solar gets put into the system, it's generated, very low marginal cost, there's not enough value that comes back in to pay for the rest of the investments to keep the system going and to maintain energy security. So that's the issue we're looking at this year in our World Energy Outlook. This is a challenge for a lot of the countries and states and national bodies in the US, Australia, Europe, that are now getting to those higher levels of renewables, and what's happening, you know, to the financial situation of the fossil-related assets that are supporting them, the nuclear plants, coal plants. What's going to happen to those to make sure that there's enough of those assets in the system to to make sure you have energy security and economic viability of the energy sector. So that's something that we'll be looking at this year in the World Energy Outlook. So I think I've tried to answer those questions. They were such brilliant questions that I think we'll be thinking about them for a long time.
Ambassador, and I think you have mapped out some very important trend lines for us and the energy dynamic for the next few decades. Let me invite you all for your questions, comments, observations on the presentation. And yes, sir.
Thank you. On a lighter note, I was reminded that driver of Einstein told him I can give that lecture anytime. And he did that a couple of times, but the fourth time he got a complicated question. He said, my driver at the back can answer that question. So I now am very grateful to you. You've given me a lot of information. But I'm coming from a retired naval officer. And Indian Maritime Foundation, we study energy security. But we also look at energy security as transportation. So my few questions, very quick questions, will be towards that because she already. Have you studied what is the future of oil in the gas and oil in the South China Sea? Because that could reduce the dependence on the Indian Ocean. Have you studied the Arctic route, which is opening, and very fast it is opening? The third question is, have you studied battery power? Because the sun and, we can't use it at sea, but you can always store ashore power from the sun and the wind. So lithium batteries are coming into the Japanese submarines and almost replacing what was alternate propulsion, underwater. So I don't know, my question is those. And then finally, because we also study this in the Indian Maritime Foundation, will Germany and Japan go back to nuclear power? Another just last question, because it's connected with what we also, Bhutan and Doklam, and we have had some problems with China. I think the problems will not go away during many lifetimes. India was promising Bhutan a lot of extraction of hydropower. But suddenly our Prime Minister has told us that we are oversupplied with, I think you would know, the 300 gigawatts. Is it true that we are surplus in power today? And therefore, we will not be able to buy from Nepal or any of these countries which we used to subsidize. I'm sorry I've taken you on to what she said, a global thing, because your presentation on figures has been very useful.
The South China Sea and the Arctic route, are you basically saying, are you asking whether the energy security issues could be relieved by taking different transport routes? Or are you talking about the method of supplying those ships with oil or whatever?
I'm talking to you because it will reduce the Japan, China, and North Korea. The cost of transportation to Europe will come to half.
You're talking about the routes, changing the routes, changing the routes.
Indian Ocean may reduce the traffic, which you have shown is massive, 70 million barrels of oil every day. If that's not gone, and that is causing what Mahan said. Sorry, I'm taking you to the Navy route, but it'll be very useful.
Right. I think these are good points. I personally have not seen the IEA research into some of the new transit routes. I know there's a lot of talk about Arctic route because of climate change being more attractive. But as far as other changes in transport routes, I think this is a good point, and we'll take it back and we'll take a look at it. In terms of battery storage for shipping, and sure, but basically there is a big debate, and we are looking very carefully at the whole question about how ships will be powered in the future, maritime. Can there be basically decarbonization of maritime transport? So we do have a big research effort underway on that. There are various things that are going on in that space right now. Some of it's driven environmentally. by the IMO that's looking to put in tighter carbon standards. So we are expecting that there will be a decrease in the use of the heavy bunker oil. A number of ships will change to diesel to meet some of the environmental requirements. That's one thing that's definitely happening. That's incorporated into our oil market outlook that we have a copy of here. So we think that's happening soon, and that could affect things like refinery runs and other things, could be very significant. We're also looking into LNG for ships. That's definitely on the horizon. It may be, again, something that is more feasible in the future. And we're also looking into other options for a ship kind of propulsion technologies, other low-carbon options. So we're definitely looking at all those things. Batteries, I'm not sure right now that they're competitive, but that's definitely battery, solar is a possibility. Germany and Japan going back to nuclear power. Well, Germany is fairly firm on phasing out their nuclear. I think this is supported pretty much countrywide, and seems to be on a path that is moving inevitably in a certain direction. There's still questions about how the remaining nuclear power could be, what would substitute for that nuclear power in order to prevent the carbon emissions from rising. But Germany is quite, I think, emphatic. Japan, on the other hand, government of Japan is on a path to restore the nuclear power that was knocked out after the Fukushima accident. It's taken quite a bit of time. It's a gradual process, but the Japanese government is quite intent on recovering the confidence, in particular, in its oversight, its regulatory oversight of the nuclear sector. They have a number of issues, public acceptance issues. The IEA actually has worked on that issue with the government of Japan. Actually, I traveled Japan about a year and a half ago to present a report on that. And the Japanese are, gradually in the process of restoring their nuclear power. Japan, of course, has a unique energy security challenge because it's virtually it's 100% dependent on imports for all its oil and all its gas and all its coal. So it has a kind of unique energy security challenge. So for Japan, the nuclear power is quite important in terms of its own energy security and energy sustainability in terms of being an important part of its low-carbon future. On the hydro and Bhutan issue, I am turning to my right, or maybe to my left. Maybe to my left, because I do not know the answer to that question.
Yes, India has surplus capacity and is a net exporter now. But hydropower, like renewable energy, is seasonally intermittent. So there are complementarities when we will require Bhutan's electricity.
What concerns me, it's a poor country. We were subsidizing it.
That's true.
Now suddenly we've cut.
No, there is net energy export. So we do import also.
Country needs money.
No, the import is still there. But they.
Do more new plants.
That may not
That is
happen.
my question.
Dr. Simons, I just wanted to ask a short question. Do you think there's a case that can be made out for making lithium a global access mineral so that we can preempt a certain set of countries, developing an interest in mining the metal and not providing others access to it? Well, today is the foundation of the battery industry, right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Is there a case for declaring lithium as a global access mineral, much like the moon?
No, I would think that if you asked the Chileans or the Bolivians or whoever have the minerals now they might think that this is, would be similar to asking them to whatever, give away their copper or their gold or something. So I suppose, I haven't heard this idea before. And so I don't know. But I think there are a fair number of investors who've put some effort into developing lithium reserves around the world, and I think there are ownership structures and things. So perhaps you'd need some kind of big global consensus, but I haven't seen any indication that we're moving. Right. Well, yes, certainly a lot of the technologies that now look like they depend on one mineral, maybe 20 years on, there could be substitutes and things. So yes, it does appear right now that lithium is quite critical, but there's a lot of R&D going on into other battery technologies. And so I'm not absolutely sure that that would be the case. And there's also a lot of... It's an interesting idea. But certainly, the technology field is quite wide open. And there's, I think we may, there could be things that we don't expect will happen, in the future that, could change some of these fundamental assumptions.
Thank you very much for giving us this enlightening and eye-opener energy transitioning presentation. I have two questions. I myself, Dr. Malti Goyal, I was serving in the Ministry of Science and Technology as senior advisor. Now I'm not. So I want to ask you two questions. One is about the distribution of various sources in the global energy during the period 2010 to 2016 and 17 to 40. So I find that in the figure, if you can go to that, well, I can ask that. And the renewable energy dominates in both the scenarios. That is one. So I would like to know how the coal energy is going to go down. Is it only in the Asian countries or whole global world? Basically, how the coal energy you envisage to go down in the scenario of 2040. At the same time, we have electricity for all also. So how you envisage that? And the second question is about carbon capture and storage or carbon sequestration. What will be the future of carbon sequestration in the light of the solar energy anticipated growth?
Okay, so
Yeah, this one.
the first question first. So this is just electricity.
Yeah.
This is just capacity addition. Okay? So we do think that investments in electricity. However, the actual electricity output, which I don't have here, is going to be quite different from this slide. Because a lot of the coal plants have a useful life of 50 years, and they won't have been decommissioned, as well as the gas. So in terms of output, I don't have an output slide here, but the actual contribution of output of renewables will be much lower. So that's right, it will be lower, but it will be increasing. But it won't be so dominant. Now, one of the questions will be, OECD countries are phasing out coal, and in some cases are phasing out coal before the end of their useful lives, but we are not expecting the emerging countries will necessarily phase out the coal before the end of the useful life, because it's expensive to do that. You have a stranded asset. So we're expecting there'll still be coal in the system, still be gas in the system. Renewables will ramp up. The other thing is that this is capacity additions, And since the renewables are intermittent, they may only work 40% of the time, et cetera. So this slide gives you an indication of the trend, but you still have the base. You still have the base load there. So it will take longer. Now, in a 2-degree scenario, you'll have to phase out the coal quicker. But will there be a political will to do that? And in the view of the IEA, that can only be done if there's a pretty high carbon price. So you need to have a carbon price that motivates a quicker uptake of renewables and that motivates the retirement of some of the fossil assets earlier. There was a second question.
Yes, CCS.
The CCS. Right, on the CCS, again, the perspective of the IEA, the CCS costs are coming down, which is a very good thing. CCS is absolutely essential in our scenarios in order to get close to an environmentally sustainable future. It's particularly important in industry, but it's also important in power generation. Our expectation is you will need some type of carbon price, either a shadow price or a real price, or another incentive that can make the CCS competitive. But that type of incentive doesn't have to be anywhere near as large as people have suspected it to be in the past. So, for example, we have been quite optimistic that the US has just put into place essentially a tax credit for CCS, which we think can motivate new spending in this area. It's not that large of a tax credit, but it relates to, again, the per ton of carbon saved. And in Europe also, the European exchange trading system, it's expected that system will be strengthening over the next few years, and the implicit carbon price in Europe will be going up, and this should enable more CCS plants to be competitive on their own. So but still, we think that there needs to be more government R&D, more demonstration plants developed also in order to drive those costs down. Because renewables have had a lot of support, a lot of government support over the years, and that's helped them drive those costs down. Or you've had very high feed-in tariffs, countries like Japan and Germany, and that's enabled these industries to build up, China. But CCS hasn't had that type of support. And so the costs are still kind of high. But if you had some support, initial support, in the view of the IEA, that could enable those cost curves to start shifting.
Besides solar energy, because looking at this diagram, CCS has no potential.
Well, this is just, that's not so true, because CCS not only used in power generation, but also in decarbonization of industry. It's very, very important. Cement industry, steel industry, some of these industries that burn fuels directly, it would be very hard to decarbonize those sectors. They can't be electrified very easily, and they have a lot of carbon emissions. So CCS in industry is something that I think that from the IEA perspective, I see Bruce is nodding his head because I believe he's a CCS expert. Bruce, do you want to add to this?
No, I was just going to add with India's ambition to triple the size of its steel sector, for example, and also quite committed to its climate change commitments under Paris. There seems to be something I'm tracking anyway. Is there a role for CCS in the steel sector going forward? Because it seems like a technology that works there. Cement you've mentioned as well, another big consuming sector as well. So CCS has been proven to work on power, but I think it has broader applicability, particularly in some of those sectors that are harder to decarbonise. So that's where I think there might well be a place for it in India.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Now, I have a question regarding nuclear. So why doesn't nuclear increase that much compared to gas? And as far as I remember correctly, nuclear is much cleaner than natural gas in terms of CO2. And also the cost of the nuclear generation is much lower than that of the liquefied gas. And you mentioned that the most of the gas is liquefied gas, which will be increasing toward 2040. So I just wanted to know the reason why that difference happens.
So basically, these projections are on the basis of currently declared government policies in different countries and current trends. And the IEA recently held a nuclear workshop within the last 3 weeks to kind of take a look at what could be done to stimulate a faster uptake of nuclear. But what we see around the world right now is there's been quite a big slowdown in terms of nuclear investment over the last several years, and nuclear starts are down. We haven't had the costs decline as much as people would expect, so it's difficult for nuclear to compete with renewables. Has tremendous benefits from a CO2 perspective and from production of baseload electricity. But if you kind of take a look around the world at the trends, a number of European countries are decommissioning nuclear even before the end of its useful life, or they're not extending the life of plants. This is a major challenge. We're trying to discuss ways that those plants could be further extended, their useful lives. In the US, there's pressure on nuclear because of competition with gas and renewables. So the US government is taking a very hard look at how it could somehow get involved to extend the life of current nuclear plants. China is moving ahead, India is moving ahead on new nuclear, but this is basically a net figure that nets out the declines from Europe, some of the expected retirements in the US, and then the net increase is largely China, it's mostly China and some India. Because around the rest of the world, there's not a huge amount of impetus to push ahead with nuclear power. Now, there's a number of things that are happening in the R&D space that could change that. There's a lot of research going on small modular reactors, but up to now, we haven't seen those cost declines that really could spark competitiveness. Japan's another issue. I think we're expecting Japan will come back in nuclear, but that's largely restoring power that that had been temporarily been put offline. So I think nuclear is a big challenge. Certainly the IEA, the scenario, our 2-degree scenario, has a lot more nuclear than this. But in our base scenario, nuclear basically holds its own in terms of its percentage of global electricity production, about 12%. But the other thing about nuclear is that since it produces flat out at 100%, and it's always running, its capacity factors are extremely high compared to renewables, or even compared to coal or compared to gas. So the nuclear is very, very, very steady. So in the U.S., it's every year the nuclear power actually goes up by a little bit as they achieve additional efficiencies on the existing plant. U.S. nuclear is still almost 20% of the U.S. Power grid, which is pretty impressive because there hasn't been a new nuclear plant built in the U.S. in, I think, 20 years. So it's a very important part of the electricity system, but there's a lot of competition.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Simmons, thank you for being here and taking your time. You mentioned stranded assets, and I would like to shed some light on the Indian situation. May I ask you to go one slide back, because that gives basically the point of what I'm talking about. Yes, that is great. And I'm kind of focusing on the solar PV, and these are average numbers, I guess. For India, we can say that already since 2017, we're talking about a third of what it says here. So what we see in India, we have the discoms basically buying the cheap solar renewable power for about 2.4 rupees per unit. Coal is bought for 3.7 rupees, and the break even for coal is 5. That means what happens is that basically coal is, running in debt. So we're talking in India about 50 gigawatts, which are stranded assets already, and this effect is even rising over time. And we have the same effect in Europe, by the way, because renewables kind of getting into the market, the average price going down because of the supply. So my question is IEA is kind of conservative with the prediction, but don't you think that price effect will not drive the whole development into renewables faster? And about nuclear power, it's probably the most expensive source of power. That's probably the reason why it's not kind of the future, because you have to include all the costs for the waste issue and the security issues. That makes it the most expensive source of power. Thank you.
No, I think you're absolutely right. That's why we're seeing the increases in renewables. But then the question becomes, which is the question we're trying to deal with with many of our member countries, how do you deal with the variability on the renewables when the shares get higher? The renewables are cheap when they're producing, but when they're not producing, how do you manage the system? And so, and how do you manage the system to keep some of that fossil power in the system, even though it appears to be losing money? So this is an issue. This is an issue that that many of our countries are facing. So how do you keep that energy security in the system when the renewable shares get higher? It's easy when the renewable share 5–10%, but then when the renewables start spurting up, but you still have to manage the variability. And so this is, I think, this is the challenge that we're trying to grapple with. And how do you avoid premature retirement of some assets that are very important for energy security that you want to keep in the system, but they're not making the money. You're not making money to keep them in the system, but you need them to balance off your renewables. So these are some big challenges that are faced, many places around the world, so I think we don't have all the answers, but we're working with pretty much all the countries that we work with on this precise issue.
My question on oil prices. It was believed that due to low oil prices, investments in oil and gas sector was not coming in. Now the oil prices have risen, but despite the fact that oil prices have increased, investment has still not coming in oil and gas sector. That is one.
Sorry, oil prices have risen about what?
Yeah. Yeah. And my second question is what is the future of oil prices by the end of this year and maybe 2019?
Okay. On the oil investment issue, actually, yesterday we put out our investment report. It's on our website, and our annual investment report that took a look at 2017, and we did see a slight bump up in oil and gas upstream investment, although electricity investment is still greater than oil and gas upstream investment. We do have some concerns about the levels of oil and gas investment, whether they're sufficient to offset, the decline rates in oil fields around the world. But we also note in the report that the investment in oil and gas is getting a lot more efficient these days. So you can get a lot more out of a dollar of oil investment than you used to. Just the technology improvements, the digitalization improvements have been huge. And also the oil companies, for various reasons, having to do with investor risk as well as just pressures, are looking to invest in projects that have a much quicker payoff. And that are lower capital investment projects. So we're seeing a lot more investment in the non-conventional oil in the US, for example, as well as projects in countries like Brazil, Mexico, where the assets are very good and where the technology costs have come down. Norway as well, the technology costs have come down. So it seems that they've gotten very lean and mean in the oil industry. So that's a positive sign, but there's still concerns. And there's also concerns because a lot of the oil and gas investment is still state-owned enterprises and that have their own systems. So I think that is concern. As far as oil prices, we don't predict oil prices. The IEA does not, we don't predict prices, so we're not in that business. But we do issue oil market report. We issued oil market report last week that kind of looks at the supply-demand balance out to the end of 2019. And we do see some tightness in the oil markets. We pointed out, I mentioned before, there are areas in the supply area that are under quite a bit of stress, Venezuela in particular. Libya is another. There are others where there's uncertainties. Iran falls in that category. So, there are a number of areas on the supply side. And on the demand side, the demand outlook looks pretty good because the world economy is actually, growing about 4% a year. Now, India is very accustomed to growing at a lot more than 4%, but the rest of the world hasn't been growing that quickly lately, but now we have pretty good global economic growth. And we've had a couple of years of pretty solid oil consumption growth, even last year in Europe. And Europe had been flat for years, and oil consumption went up in Europe last year. Like, people in Europe are, buying SUVs and, driving. So, for the longest time, people thought, Europe, it's stagnant. Well, it's kind of going up a little bit. So, U.S. also, the costs have been low. People may drive a bit more. Now, we also see the prices are going up now, as you say, and so we do see that will have some effect on demand, global demand, but we haven't ratcheted down our global demand projections that much, but we ratcheted them down a little bit because we think that these cost issues, will have some dampening effect on demand, but we still see, the market being in a bit of a tight position.
So we have a few.
Potential for concentrated solar. And my second question is that if fusion becomes feasible in the next 20 years, how would the scenario change?
Wastage of resources is the biggest problem, and in developing countries, how you are working for it. And second question is that.
I'm sorry, the first question is?
Wastage of resources.
I'm sorry?
Wastage of resources. Wasting of resources. And second question is that we cannot forget the population explosion. We have a limited land and we have a limited resources, and population is increasing. And how will balance the resources? And third question is that America denied last year Paris climate change concern to work according it. And if same like other countries will deny it, then what will be happen in the future?
Capacity growth and market for natural gas and liquid LNG over the medium to long term?
Question was on CSP, which is concentrating solar power, concentrated solar power. So the IEA has, for I think at least 20 years, been very, very optimistic, has had very high and optimistic projections for CSP, which have come in always below the targets. Because CSP, until recently, has not been able to cut its costs as quickly as solar PV. However, in the past couple of years, the CSP in competitive auctions, costs have come down quite substantially in Chile, in Morocco, in the UAE. So CSP appears, and of course CSP has the benefit that it doesn't have the same problems of intermittency as solar PV, provided that you can keep the resource, you can preheat the salt and keep the salt hot and keep the turbines moving. So, which appears to be the case for the new CSP developments. So I think CSP is looking more positive now than it was. We still have it in the red category on our technologies, but the costs have been coming down. So it's definitely something, it's a technology that we're keeping a close look on, and it does seem to be promising, especially in the case of Chile, when they've combined it with PV. They have joint projects serving the mining industry in the north, and they appear to be competitive. So I think CSP is very interesting. Just personally, I'm a big fan of CSP. When I was U.S. ambassador in Chile, I took the Chilean president up to see some CSP plants in Nevada. This was 2008. And it was quite exciting. I mean, the technology is amazing. If you've never seen one of the plants, you've got to go and see one. They are absolutely extraordinary, this tower system. I mean, the infrastructure is, it's stunning, but the costs are the issue. You know, it's like a lot of these things, you get, you know, when are you going to get that cost breakthrough? So perhaps through the auctions, we'll get the cost breakthroughs. Fusion, I am not the expert on fusion, although the IEA has a number of working groups looking at it. Certainly there's a huge amount of research going on, and there's a lot of enthusiasm among the research community. But I am not really, I'm not sure whether 20 years is the right kind of time frame or not. I don't know whether it may be a bit optimistic. I'm just not in a position to know when the technology will, again, be ready. Wastage of resources, I think you're referring to kind of energy efficiency type wastage, not just refuse and things like, you're not talking about biomass refuse, right? You're talking about energy efficiency. Well, you know, energy efficiency is extremely important to the IEA. We think that energy efficiency will contribute at least 1/3 of CO2 reductions in a 2-degree scenario. But again, it's an issue that you know, as they say, you don't cut any ribbons with an energy efficiency project, except maybe if you're India and you have the LED project, then you cut some ribbons. But generally speaking, it's very hard work. It requires coordination among many different ministries. It requires a very big investment of the private sector. It requires data that is not collected yet. But you know, huge potential there, and it's something that, you know, we in the IEA are working on. This week, we are conducting the largest energy efficiency training in our history in Indonesia, and I think we'd like to do a similar program here in India. Is that right? Yes. Are we going to do one? Yes. We are. We hope to do one. Yeah, we have, actually, we're trying to create in the IEA what we call communities of practice in the 6 major energy efficiency work streams. This is a very bold new approach where we get practitioners together in energy efficiency in industry, appliances, transportation, also in monitoring and data and statistics, and kind of create communities that talk to each other, they exchange best practices among the countries. So it's important for us. The population explosion. Yes, of course, population rates are very different around the world. So there are a number of our countries, including IEA member countries, whose populations are declining right now. So, I mean, it's very different. And so the energy profiles of the countries do relate a lot to the population profiles. So we have countries like Japan, Korea, where populations are declining. We have countries like India where they're increasing. We have countries like China where they're probably going to be declining fairly soon. So definitely kind of the relationship between the population, all our scenarios, are very much related to population growth, economic growth, level of activity. But again, India is kind of unique because per capita energy consumption here is so low and the population growth is growing, so that I think that's one of the main reasons we think that India is, coming to the center of the global stage. The population impact combined with the growth of the middle class. So it's something where I think India is fairly unique. Maybe Indonesia in a similar category, some of the countries in Southeast Asia. Paris Agreement, yes, the Paris Agreement is something that we follow very closely. We're involved. We participate in the discussions. The climate change expert group, the IEA, is very active. We do a lot of analytical work, especially on CO2 emissions, measuring CO2 emissions. I don't know if you go on our website. We have calculated that after 3 years of flat CO2 emissions in 2017, the emissions went up by about 1.5%. Not necessarily because people were employing energy that much differently, but largely because economic growth went up. And so people were just driving their cars more and using more appliances. So, but we are, we're involved with the Paris Agreement in many different ways. A lot of our scenarios, tracking. We consult with countries on their 2050 strategies. We do, some technical assistance, so we're very involved. We participate in the COP meetings and the dialogues, although we're not we're an observer. But we're very involved, and we look at this very carefully. Then the final question about will the renewables push, cut natural gas or LNG out of the system? You're talking about power sector, or are you talking about everything? Mostly power sector? Everything. We actually, the IEA, even in our 2-degree scenario, we're quite bullish on natural gas. And even in our climate-friendly scenario, we're expecting natural gas consumption will increase by about 1.5% a year. We think that renewables are, over time, more likely to, if they're aggressively deployed, cut into coal, cut into oil more. But natural gas, for various reasons, a lot of it having to do with environmental issues, has a favorable future in many countries, particularly in China. And China is really expanding its use of natural gas rapidly to address environmental questions. Also the US, just because of the abundance and the low cost. So, and those are huge markets. And if you take the China and the US together, you got probably almost half global energy. So those two countries, because of the unique situations, they're going to be keeping natural gas use up, as well as Europe. Europe's going to want to get out of coal. So there, there could be definitely other developing countries where you could see some cuts in gas, but I think our expectation is that gas has quite a bright future, and LNG in particular, there'll be a lot more gas trade. There'll be different ways that gas gets traded, and its prospects are favorable, and that it won't be overshadowed by renewables.
Thank you, sir. I think all that's left for me is to thank the ambassador for coming here and on talk. Thank you, sir. Thank you all for coming.